Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. If you peek behind the curtains of the most successful breweries and ingredient suppliers, you'll find an almost zealous commitment to quality. With beer and ingredients, there are so many attributes you could look at, and there's so much data you could gather and collect, but what do you do with it? How do you combine it all together into a picture that's usable and carries practical implications? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab, I'm speaking with Dr. Julia Jennings and Jeff Dailey from John I. Haas about combining sensory and chemistry data to make practical decisions. So there's a ton of data that you can collect on beer and on raw ingredients, and a ton of different methods for collecting them, all with different implications. So how does one figure out what's important and what's not? Well, I'll ask Julia and Jeff. Julia is a chemist by trade, and Jeff is, of course, the lab's resident sensory scientist. So while you might think they come from different sides of the coin, we'll talk about how they work together to ensure product quality at John I. Haas. We'll dive into a practical experiment that they looked at, looking at shelf stability of a new hop product and how they could use chemistry and sensory data to make decisions about recommendations to consumers. So how long to let this product sit, where to let it sit, how long is it stable, what does it do to the beer, all of that sort of stuff. Turns out they actually use both chemistry and sensory data to make these kinds of decisions. It's a great exercise in using data to make practical decisions, which I hope you'll enjoy. But first, I wanted to say another big thank you to our patrons. None of this would be possible without you. If you're not currently a patron, I encourage you to head to patreon.com/Brewlosophy and check out the monthly contribution levels. In addition to the feel-good vibes of helping to support the work we do here at Brewlosophy, you get access to a bunch of awesome rewards depending on the different pledge levels that you choose. You can get access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. And this month's guest is none other than Jamil Zainasheff. He almost doesn't need an introduction. He's a homebrewing legend and author of Brewing Classic Styles, co-author of the Yeast Book, which is part of the Brewing Elements series from the Brewers Association. He's got an incredible amount of knowledge. He's a wealth of information about both homebrewing and commercial brewing. He used to own his own commercial brewery. So he'll be available in July to answer your brewing questions. I hope you'll take advantage of this great reward by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Thank you to everyone that's left a rating or review of the show. I truly appreciate hearing from you, and those ratings help other listeners like you find the show. Without those reviews, we wouldn't have the Applying the Science series with Jordan, so keep them coming. I read every review, and I want to hear from you. If you haven't rated or reviewed the show, I'd love to hear from you. Feedback is brought to you by the clever folks from North America's leading hop supplier, Haas, who developed Incognito, a 100% all-natural hop product crafted to deliver highly concentrated flavor while maximizing brewing efficiency and reducing process loss. You wanted more varieties, and the Haas team heard you. Incognito is now available in 8 of the most popular Whirlpool hop varieties: Citra, Mosaic, Chinook, Centennial, Equinaut, Eldorado, HBC 472, and Sabro. All the hoppy goodness you expect without adding any actual hop matter means less process loss, increased profits, and best of all, more beer. You can learn more about Incognito and all the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, Brewlosophy patron Rob Cohane wrote in. Hey, Rob. He says, "Hey, Cade, hope all is well with you. Just a quick note on yeast foraging. Jeff Mello over at Bootleg Biology did great seminars on this at past homebrew conferences. Rob actually provides a link to these homebrew seminars. I can email those to you if you want, but you can also Google what is wild yeast, where is it, and how do you brew with it to check out Jeff Mello's sessions at Bootleg Biology about doing this at home. Rob also also says Bootleg Biology also sells, quote, yeast wrangling kits on their website that provides all of the basics of doing this. Cheers. Hey, thanks, Rob, for sending this in. That's awesome that this is available to homebrewers. If you've got interest in foraging for your own yeast, totally check out these kits. Again, go to Bootleg Biology and check them out. They actually look really cool and look like they come with everything that you need. So thanks again, Rob, for sending this in. All right, I'll be back in a few minutes with Dr. Julia Jennings and Jeff Dailey to talk about combining sensory and chemistry data to make practical decisions. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
Today, we discuss Miro. Today, I want to talk about the hellscape that is technical diagramming, right? Everybody's nodding their heads right now, And there is a potential solution that I want to share. There was one name that several people brought up. I did some digging, and it's kind of nuts how much this program Miro has for developers. I have to share this. It could potentially be a game changer for you. So my favorite part about Miro is that half the work is already done. Like right now, typically we spend hours starting diagrams from scratch, gathering information. You get buy-in from every team. That's a lot of work to do. But Miro has a full set of integrations with the tools you're probably already using. And they also offer open APIs and SDKs for custom solutions for all those niche diagramming use cases we have to do, right? So the end result is the same, but it doesn't take forever. It's a massive, massive time saver. I'm transforming basic flowcharts and network architectures, and it all lives in one place. So are you using Miro? Have you used it? I want to hear. That's MIRO.com.
Brewlosophy originally became popular through the Experiment series, where we take a brewing variable, brew 2 beers based on the variable, and serve it to tasters in a blind triangle test. These sensory results give us an indication of whether tasters in that experiment were able to tell the difference between those 2 beers. In the Brew Lab, we focus on studies that often look at the same brewing variables, but they also include chemical or biological results. That's because when you pair chemical and sensory results, you can learn a lot of really cool things about beer. With me in the lab today to talk about how they apply chemistry and sensory results in their daily jobs, pun, are Dr. Julia Jennings and Jeff Dailey from John I. Haas. Welcome to the Brew Lab, Julia.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, and so this is your first time on the show, Julia, right? Are you excited, nervous?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I'd say more excited.
Yeah, good. I understand you've listened to some of the episodes of the show, so I'm glad to have you on finally. I mean, you're kind of like the resident analytical chemist at Haas.
Yeah, I'd say I'm more of organic chemist subbing in as an analytical chemist, but I know enough analytical to get me in trouble anyway.
No, sure. Yeah. Well, organic chemistry and analytical chemistry, there's a lot that overlaps there. And organic chemistry is a lot of what, goes on in the hop world. So, and Jeff, of course, our resident sensory scientist. Welcome back.
Hey. Crowd goes wild. Yeah, exactly. Your listeners probably don't remember, but the second episode I was on a year and a half ago, I did refer to someone as our resident hop witch. Julia is our resident hop witch.
That's right.
Organic
exactly.
chemistry in action, making the things that make beer taste better.
Yes. All right, Julia, you're the hop witch now. the hop witch for the Brew Lab. And so cool. And welcome back, Jeff. Again, you've been a frequent person on the show, and of course, you caught my pun earlier, and that's never happened to you before in your life ever. No one's ever made that.
It's almost like it's your job to come up with those things.
Nice. Perfect. All right. Well, good. Hopefully listeners are still listening and they haven't turned the show off yet. So I always want to start off the show before we get into it. What we're going to talk about today, again, is marrying chemistry and sensory data. So, hey, look, I've got a sensory scientist and a chemist on the show to talk about these two things. And so I want to do a little bit of introductions first. And Julia, again, your title, I believe, is R&D Scientist at John I. Haas. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it might be research scientist, but yeah, it's a pretty broad term. Just some background on me. I came here straight out of grad school. I finished my PhD in organic chemistry right when the pandemic was starting. And I also desperately wanted to move home, which for me is to the Yakima area. And so I also love beer. I homebrewed all through college and grad school. My dad is a homebrewer.
Cool.
So it just seemed like a really fun and cool work to get into. And since joining Johnny Haas, I've really just taken to product development. So that's mostly what I do. I do mostly new product development, some process improvement, and some analytical work as well. But I'm mostly focused on developing new products, just really taking a step away from organic chemistry because we're not really doing that much synthetic here, but just looking at all of the ways we can take hops apart and put them back together in a way that builds tools for brewers to use.
Yeah, and we're going to get to talk about one of those new products today on the show, and some research you did looking at the shelf life of that product. And that's super interesting. This is also really nerdy for me, too, because I'm also training to be a chemist in some way. I'm a food science technologist, but working in a chemistry lab. So it's also really cool for me to nerd out on studies like this and look at the analysis you're doing and compare it to what we're doing at OSU, too, which is fun. And of course, Jeff, Sensory Program Manager at John I. Haas. What have you been up to since last we talked?
Oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Doing our recovering from CBC is a big part of that. And of course, as soon as CBC is over, that means harvest is about 2 weeks out, or at least it feels like it. So we've been getting ready there. It's
exactly
looking to be a bumper crop. So hope everyone likes really excellent hops in their beer.
People do. And people do. We love hops and also all of the amazing advanced hop products that Haas has to offer as well, too. So this show came about. I met Julia. Actually, I've met Julia a couple times, but I spent some time talking to her at the ASBC 2023 annual meeting in Pittsburgh, where she gave a presentation about using chemistry and sensory data to monitor the shelf life of a new advanced hop product that they were testing out. And this really piqued my interest because, of course, we talked about advanced hop products where Jeff and Shay Maloney came on the show on episode 102, and we kind of went through, all of the current offerings. It was like the dry hopping Spectrum, the Whirlpool Incognito, Hop Haze, Kettle Ready, all of the different versions and attributes of this. And there's a new one that we're going to talk about today. I'll let them introduce it whenever we get there. But this was a really cool thing for me to look at because it's marrying chemistry and sensory. And like I said at the top of the show, right, Brewlosophy is all about sensory. We do the sensory components of it, doing triangle tests and stuff. That's where Jeff comes in. And then you've got Julia, who's doing chemistry. And that's also something that we do at OSU in some of these more, I'm not going to say more scientific, but like more expansive research, proposals, right? Or commercial studies that are done. And so there's two goals for today's episode. One of those is discuss the experiment that Julia, Jeff, and the team at Haas performed looking at shelf life. But then the other is also to just kind of broadly discuss how chemistry and sensory can be paired together for a brewer, because they're two sides, they're two really important pieces of information. So I want to kind of start right there at the top, right? Let's talk about how chemistry and sensory can be paired together. So I kind of want to just put the two of you in opposite corners of a boxing ring and ask which is more important, sensory data or chemistry data. But I think we should start with an actual question. And maybe I'll ask this of each of you, right? So hopefully you both have an answer for it. What's the purpose of collecting data? And maybe Julia, you want to start with you?
Yeah. So ultimately the purpose of collecting any data, whether it be sensory or chemistry, to me is to make decisions. So we collect chemical data because it can help us make decisions about our hops. So for example, if you are collecting data on hop storage index and you have something that has a really, really high HSI, that may influence on whether you decide to brew with that hop or what beer you decide to use it in. And in terms of, doing a shelf life or analyzing products, we want to know what chemically is there. So we know, if we make it a second time, is it still consistent? And then also, ideally we build a model saying we know that this is the minimum or maximum quantity that we want of that compound to say that it passes. So for example, you might want to know exactly how much alpha acids are in an extract. So you know how much alpha acids to use to get a bittering that you want. It's really straightforward with things like alpha acids, beta acids, things like that. They're really easy to quantify. It is so much more difficult to do with aroma. It's still worth doing, I think, but it is like multiple magnitudes more difficult to be doing chemical analysis for aroma.
Yeah, I still remember one of it was Jeff, actually. I think maybe in the first episode that he did, where he was talking about all the different neural pathways that are your nose, right? I mean, and I think he gave this examples, like when we think about taste, it's 5 tastes or maybe 6, right? So there's like 6 things that we're talking about. But with aroma, there's who knows how many, right? There's just so many things that and different combinations. And I love that you gave a chemical example, Julia, because that's fantastic. You gave alpha acids, right? And you said the point of collecting data is to make decisions. So whenever you see on the package of hops that comes from John I. Haas, that package says Citra is 13% alpha acids. And that gives you, the brewer, information that you need in order to, add bitterness to your beer. Well, maybe not Citra. Hopefully nobody's using Citra as a bittering hop. but as just an example. All right. So Jeff, same question to you then. What's the purpose of collecting data, maybe from a sensory scientist perspective?
It's fundamentally the same thing because sensory is actually a science, and we treat it that way. The purpose of collecting data, whether it's instrumental, chemical, sensory, is to have an objective, and I'm doing an end run. It's to have an objective measure of the quality of a product, whether it's raw hops, pelletized hops, extracts. It gives us an understanding from the human perspective, what is the likely experience of either the brewer when they're inputting it into their beer, when they open the can or whatever. And then also, because we brew with everything that we make, what's the end goal or what's the end outcome? And eliciting a response from individuals, a large number of individuals, to get a clear sampling, a normalized sampling of a population, means that we do have a fairly clear picture of the probable outcomes. And it's because of that we can make more competent decisions. It's not just shooting from the hip.
Yeah, I like that, right? Again, you're ultimately serving your beer to the consumer. The consumer's got to buy your beer and drink your beer, and so you need to know that that your beer tastes the way you want it to, and that the consumer likes it or doesn't like it. And all of these questions are things that you can answer with sensory data. So I guess I'll ask you this one, Jeff. So do chemistry and sensory data serve different purposes, or are they just different means to an end?
They serve the purpose of whatever the intent of the scientist is that's using them. For our purposes here, nice. They serve the same purpose, except for when someone tries to use chemistry to predict sensory outcomes and therefore get me fired, which I don't appreciate. But that's not what we're doing here, and we're going to get into that.
Yeah, or eliminating the sensory scientist. All right, Julie, same question for you then. Do you think chemistry and sensory data serve different purposes, or are they different, or are they the same? Same purpose, different means.
I think they serve the same purpose. I think in a lot of ways, people are just kind of GCs. Our noses operate in a lot different ways, but they serve kind of the same purpose. So of course, like when we're working on new products, the main question we ask, and this is something that one of the first thing I learned when I came onto this company, and this is what our director of both research and quality will say, is that the most important question we ask about our new products is, do they make good beer? And an instrument's not going to tell me that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I mean, maybe it tells you something about that, true, but yeah, it doesn't tell you at the end of the day, right? You need a consumer, you need a human to tell you that, because the human is the one that's consuming it. It's interesting that you mentioned and compared the GC, to a human nose, right? Because like you said, the human nose is a finely tuned instrument. I think Jeff also said this in the first episode whenever I was talking to him on the podcast too, is like our nose is very, very sensitive, right? It's very capable of picking up a lot of information. A GC is super sensitive too, and can be, but it may not be as sensitive as our nose, and even then, you may not know what you're looking at with the GC, right? With the nose, if I smell something, I go, that smells like a lemon, right? And then you go, okay, that's a lemon, right? But what is a lemon? A lemon is a whole bunch of different chemical compounds and a whole bunch of different aromas that are all playing together, and may be different for each person. So Julia, then I've got a chemistry question for you. Okay, why do we care then about things like the concentration of myrcene in hops? Why do scientists look at that information, and what can you get from chemistry analysis that might be useful for the brewer? Maybe let's focus it on aroma if we can, but you can also use other chemistry examples if you want to.
Yeah, I think myrcene is maybe not the example I would use here, because I don't think a lot of myrcene translates into the final beer.
That's a very good point.
It's pretty hydrophobic, but one thing myrcene might tell you is how well your hops have been treated, because we know that myrcene being pretty volatile and prone to polymerization, if the myrcene content is much lower than you would expect, those hops probably haven't been treated very well. Yeah. But in terms of like other aroma compounds, let's pick on fatty acid esters. Those are pretty well known, just basically based on general literature and especially our prior studies, to correlate really, really well with overall liking. They are typically pretty fruity, and people like them really well. When we're looking at experimental hop varieties or advanced products, we see that there's a really high correlation between overall liking and fatty acid esters. So if we know that, maybe we have 4 different ways of making the same product, processing the same hops, and one of them has a really high content of those fatty acid esters, that might be the best way to make that product that's going to get us that, highest overall liking. So that's where we kind of want to know the chemical analysis, but you can see even there that the chemical analysis without the sensory data of knowing that overall liking was correlated really well with those fatty acid esters, the chemical data doesn't tell you a whole lot, especially because we know that not all chemical compounds that you have in an advanced product make it into the final beer and in the amounts that humans are able to detect, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I like that too about myrcene's not really a great example because it's so hydrophobic. It doesn't really make it in to the final beer. But those fatty acid esters, that's such a great example of something that you can look at and maybe measure the concentration. And then because you can correlate it with sensory data, you can then let me ask you this question. What can you do with that information? So let's say that you can correlate it and you could then measure the hops with, to see what the fatty acid ester content is and then make a decision based on that. What can you do with that information?
Yeah, so it's not something that we do a lot of now, but it's something that we would like to build towards. And that is, so for example, we can maybe get 40, maybe 100 if that is all we are doing, dead sprint, screening new hop varieties. But we can't screen as many hop varieties as we would like to as we are breeding, for example. But if we can get a high throughput method where we can measure free fatty acids, for example, and we screen every new hop variety for free fatty acid content, you could imagine that might tell you how well people might like that new hop based on at least that one measure. And then you can imagine having a library of measures where certain compounds are important and you look for those. This, depends on you building that model, which is, something that would take a large amount of time to get to where you could do something predictive with it. And I think a lot of people are interested in developing these kind of predictive methods where you can do some kind of chemical analysis and draw some conclusions from that. It's certainly something that is a work in progress, both for us and I think everyone else. It's something that a lot of us are working towards and there's growing interest in the field for, but does not yet exist.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you have all of these different varieties, it's tough to put together a sensory panel because, one of the things that Jeff has mentioned before is that humans are inconsistent between themselves, right? We're different people. And so we smell things differently and you can train. And Jeff does a lot of training and I'm going to let him talk about that here in just a minute. But people are different and they can be highly subjective, right, Jeff? And so that's a question and a challenge that you have with sensory data is making sure that you're getting enough people and that the data is reliable and that you can say, okay, yeah, this is the profile of this hop. And humans are really good at doing that, but then it takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of money. If Julia could run a couple grams or have a couple grams of hops and run it on a GC and paint a profile, that might be a screening tool that would be useful in the future. But Jeff, is there any replacement for the human nose?
No, and you're also missing out on everything else that is involved in the human experience of flavor, because not only is the human nose a GCMS, you are an LCMS, you're an HPLC, you are all of these instruments all combined together. So while with a GCMS, you could get some of the more volatile compounds, though not all of them, because each instrument, each method is different and incomplete. You're missing out on soluble compounds, different polyphenols that might have excessive or undervalued bittering properties, things like that then contribute to the overall perception of flavor. If you have a citrusy hop that then is also has a pithy type bitterness, that citrus character is more likely to be perceived as a grapefruit rather than tangerine. And it's the correspondence of these different things as a sensory experience that can be helpful for predictive analytics and breeding towards heritability when you're trying to breed towards certain traits. Whether it's as an outcome, you want a peachy hop, that's one thing that we can breed towards. That's why we see when Sabro's crossed into something, or one of our new experimentals, 1019, we see high degrees of heritability, similarities. They actually look or smell like they're a family. The other side of that, with Julia's work that we could do when we get a data set, is breeding towards specific chemical outcomes, because there are individual compounds that are valuable in their own right that maybe don't have a significant sensory outcome as a whole hop input into a beer, but are valuable for other reasons, such as I think what Julia said before, free fatty acids or other compounds that, because their interactions with yeast, biotransformations, yada, yada, new flavors, and we know that, and we could potentially predict the value of a hop or its probability of producing successful beer if it has these compounds up front. And if we see heritability, we can produce higher concentrations of these compounds that are useful in brewing. Then that makes our jobs easier, because then we don't have to screen 10,000 hops in a year to catch the one. We can move more slowly and more deliberately because we have efficient methods to help us identify what we're looking for.
So this really is like a give and take web, right? Like it's a back and forth. I feel like maybe if I had put y'all in two corners of the ring, y'all both would have just like come to the middle and started like, pushing back and forth a little bit. And then like, it sounds like it really is intertwined. Like the sensory aspects of it rely on chemistry. The chemistry aspects of it rely on sensory. And it's just this kind of nice, gestalt, this give and take back and forth between the two of you. Is that an accurate way to think about it, Jeff?
Yeah. And, I know we're going to get into it. We're here to talk about the presentation, but that's the entire purpose behind the methodologies that we chose for comparing the chemistry and the sensory data. It's that it is a give and take. It's that both sides, if you want to call them sides, are incomplete, but they are compatible.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't want to get away from this before we move on. I do want to ask you, Jeff, like, how do you make sure that the information that you're getting is accurate and dependable, and what kinds of information can you get from sensory analysis that people can then use to make decisions?
Wow, that's a big question.
Entire podcast.
I think that
question.
I think that was on our checklist of different topics to go through. So we'll come back around to different panel styles and their uses. But you're right. Okay. For what we do around here, which is largely quantitative descriptive analysis, so that's scaling intensities for a set number of aroma categories inside a lexicon. That's what we do. And it's a continuous data type. It's even noisier because there is a perception, a gradation between a 5, a 5.5, a 5.75, a 6. There is the variability of any given moment of human perception of what they're smelling, and then translating that into a physical scoring mechanism through what that's called Thurstonian modeling. But there are statistical checks involved when it comes to seeing if the data fits normality, what the skew in the data is, what are outliers. There are things that can be done to make sure that the data is, for lack of a better word, clean. But a lot of my time is spent looking for and trying to clean up data to make sure that it's actually valuable and it's not just a one-off error-ridden data set.
Right. And I mean, even on the front end too, you guys are doing all sorts of training sessions as well. I think if I remember from the presentation that Julie gave, something like 24 training sessions over the year for your panelists to make sure that they're dialed in on the attributes that you're testing.
Yeah, it's precisely that our our training protocol right now is about 8 to 10 weeks, 3 days a week, compressed down. So the entire back half of our year after harvest is dedicated to training so that everyone is calibrated, they're at their best, and then we can move into evaluating the experimental hops for the breeding program and then R&D work beyond that. Then additionally, throughout the year, we have calibration sessions and additional trainings to both onboard new potential panelists and to help me have an easier time analyzing the data, because if the panel maintains calibration through these periodic training sessions, then I get to stare at spreadsheets a little less often, trying to clean it up.
Right. Yeah, like if people aren't drifting in a way or something. I mean, that's one of those things that I've heard about with sensory panels is the panel drifts in one direction or in multiple directions.
The dreaded drift is where everyone drifts towards the middle and everything is a 5, and that
everything is a 5. Yeah. Exactly, because you get desensitized or you're not able to get the nuances. That makes sense. All right, so logistical question then, and then we're going to introduce the study and take a break. Let's say I bought some Sabro, or let's say it was Incognito or Spectrum, and on the package it'll have instructions for use. It'll have some information about what I could expect to get out of the product when I use it properly. And if I remember correctly, there's going to be some marketing language about how using this product might help with batch-to-batch consistency. Who comes up with that information? And how do you ensure that that batch of Incognito, is what you say it is, right? That it's got, the alpha acid concentration, or that it's got the flavor and aroma that I expect as a consumer. Who comes with all that, and who does the work there? Is that you guys?
Yeah, and I'm going to put it in Julie's direction because she helped with the whole innovation documentation system that creates these protocols. Plus, she was project manager for a number of the extracts that we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah.
So, I was going to assume you were going to answer, Jeff, because there is some there's some part of kind of like an internal selection process that happens. We basically believe in like low quality and low quality out. There's a more common way to put that that's less polite, but we are kind of big believers of that. So we know that if we try to make Incognito with really smoky hops, we get surprisingly smoky Incognito. Nobody wants that, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of quality checks that happen on the hops that go in. Also, it's just so much, because aroma is so difficult to quantify chemically, it is so much easier to check the hops that go in rather than to check the final products. So, if we are, for example, going to have a batch of Sabro Incognito, there are a lot more specifications on the hops that go in terms of things like HSI and other heuristics that kind of, they're not necessarily like a direct indicator of quality, but they are very, very good indirect indicators of quality. If that, does not pass, our initial rub and sniff, because we do rub and sniff on every lot that comes in. So we have notes from Jeff and from, our intake team on how that lot was evaluated. If it is not true to type, based on our scale, and if it has a really poor storage index, if it is smoky, things like that, it would not be made into Incognito, because low quality and low quality out, and we want those to be high quality products. But in terms of, what checks happen on the back end, we're not doing aroma sensory on every lot that comes out at the end. We do when we're doing initial screening. And again, we brew with everything that goes through new product development at every stage of development, because as I said, our director of quality and research here, Brian Buffin, his main thing is doesn't make good beer. And therefore we assess every product in beer. Things like that are going to be reported on the COA, total oils, alpha acids, all that stuff, there are specifications for that, and that is measured. But those are the things that are kind of like easier to quantify. And that's how you're really going to know, that something meets specifications in terms of it's going to have, the oil content or the alpha acid content.
Yeah.
When we're determining, for example, we're saying, okay, store it cold and use it within 3 years or something like that for an extract. That will, how we get those numbers is that we age it both warm and cold, and we brew with it basically until it doesn't taste good anymore. Ideally, we've set up our aging trials long enough so that we can say, so that we have the failure condition, because it's really helpful to have that context when you brew something and you're like, oh, that does not taste right. Or you can see, for example, in Jeff's data that the overall hoppy aroma intensity has gone from, like a 6 or a 7 to a 4 or a 5. That product is no longer meeting our expectations in terms of aroma. Mm-hmm. And then we're also doing chemical analysis on that as well. And that chemical analysis, similar to kind of what we presented here for Hopkick, is really more towards working to build that model where eventually we do have some indication of this chemical analysis indicates this level of quality. But it's something that we're working towards. And right now, the chemical analysis is supporting sensory, not the other way around.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you mentioned earlier, Julia. Is like there's interest in developing a chemical data set where you can profile and have high throughput analyses of these. So you can say like, okay, look, instead of having to pull a sensory panel every single time, we can run and look at these specific set of compounds by doing our chemical analysis, and then say, okay, yeah, this is how we think that this product is going to age. Then you can hand it off to sensory and marry it that way. And that's kind of exactly what you did with this shelf study with Hopkick. And you just mentioned Hopkick, so now we got to talk about it. Who wants to handle Hopkick and what that is?
I'll take this one. I'm actually super excited because I teased this in the last episode, and I've been teasing it for a couple of years too, because it's a product that was just going through its early stages when I started here 4 years ago, and it's kind of we've been growing up together, and it's a really fun product, and it's a 100% hop derived aqueous extract. Now, what that means is it looks like water, but it smells like hops. It dissolves on the cold side. It's colorless. Mm-hmm. It's got the viscosity of water. It doesn't change the color or the haze or anything else of the product that you're putting it into. It's clean label. There's no solvents, no carriers, no emulsifiers, and it's vegetation free. So it's not going to absorb any of the beer or the tea or the water or what have you that you're trying to produce to begin with. And we are commercializing it very, very soon. We had it at CBC where we had a soft launch. We had a hop water made with it, and that was very successful. And so we started to tell people more and more about the process, and we're currently doing some commercial runs to fill in inventory before we start to give it away to people.
Man, so it's totally clear. It's water, right? Or essentially, and so you can put it in to seltzers, hop waters, beer. It's kind of like hop flavoring without all of the extra stuff, right?
Exactly. It's hop flavoring, but it's also beyond hop flavoring, and that's a really important aspect for the product in my mind, because breweries are moving beyond beer. They're becoming beverage companies in their own right. There are breweries that are making hard teas, they're making soft teas, they're making energy drinks, what have you. And so we needed a product just as flexible as our customers. So with Hopkick, you get a true to type characteristic when you dose at certain levels where, oh yeah, this is definitely Citra. But if you don't want to say that something's dry hop, but you want a clean label, really robust natural flavor, use it at a lower level, and it just melds into, whatever your peach flavored cider or what have you. And it just helps boost and naturalize the flavors that you're working with. So it does everything under the sun.
So it's going to add those hop flavors that we talk about, that we always sort of like not miss, but it's like the, I don't want to call it vegetal because that's not the right way to say it, but it's like those resinous, it's the like natural vegetative hoppy flavors, right? It's not just like adding grapefruit extract or something. It's the whole gestalt of the hop. That's what you're adding in with Hopkick.
Yeah, it's more or less that the analogy that I've given in presentations before is you can make a decent peach flavor with like 4 compounds, a pretty good peach with like 15, but you're still missing the other 300 volatile and non-volatile compounds that make a natural peach. And hop oils, the terpenes, the esters, the ketones, everything in there, you add that on top of another flavor, it fills in those gaps. That's a big part of it. It is a natural base. It is holistic. It's a scaffolding to build other flavors off of, and it's better every time you use it.
Well, that's exciting. I'm excited to learn more about Hopkick, and we're going to have to get you back on the show to talk about. I'm guessing this is just the first of the future for water soluble extracts. But just to tease the study real quick, and then we'll take a quick break. You guys were looking at the shelf life of Hopkick to see how it changed over time, right? Julia already teased sort of a study that this is something that they commonly look at with their advanced hops products. And so you did that. And the unique aspect of this study is that you not only did sensory analysis with this as well, but you also did chemistry analysis to see what you could learn and what you could glean in terms of maybe representative chemicals that might explain how the product ages over time. So I want to talk about that study. We'll get into those details right after this break. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Everyone that's brewed for a while has a story about the time they found that bag of XYZ hops or malt or yeast or whatever it was in the back of their refrigerator. And of course, they brewed with it because that's what we do, waste not and all that. But being on the R&D and sensory teams at a hot ingredient supplier, do those stories make you shudder, Julia or Jeff, or both of you?
I mean, I think a little. It just depends on how it was treated, if it was sealed or not, things like that. I think definitely it's a level of risk that you're taking. As a home brewer, I might do it. If I was like selling my beer, I don't think I would.
It doesn't really make me shudder, especially at least with hops in the back of the fridge. It's more bemusing than anything else. Oh yeah, I dry hop with this 6-year-old crystal. Okay.
Yeah. Ooh, interesting.
How'd that work for you? What can I do with this old stuff? I'm like, well, it still hops. It still has alpha. It's been in the fridge. It's been in the dark, relatively oxygen free. It still has a decent amount of alpha in it. You can use it for bittering.
Right.
It's been in my fridge for 6 years. Can you issue a new COA extending the shelf life? No, that's not how that works. But no. Feel free to brew with it.
Well, but there are questions about a lot of the new advanced hop products, right? Like, let's say, especially like for a home brewer or something, let's say I'm not using a whole kilo of incognito whenever whenever I'm going to use it. So if I'm opening that thing up and just opening the lid, dumping in what I need, closing it back up, putting it in my refrigerator or wherever, is that good enough for shelf life? And with Hopkick, this is exactly what you guys are sort of looking at, is like how is the shelf life of the product and how does it change over time? So Julia, why don't you talk to us about what you were trying to do with this study and how you did it, and then we'll get into some of the results.
Yeah, sure. So what we were doing is looking at how both the chemical profile and sensory profile changed as this product aged. What we were doing was brewing the same batch of beer every time with the same recipe and with an increasingly aged Hopkick sample. So the Hopkick was aging, but the beer was always fresh. And that gives us a really clear, blank canvas for us to, be able to assess how the flavor of Hopkick was changing over time. Like I said, doing both the qualitative descriptive analysis through sensory, and then also using chemical analysis. And for that, we were using PDMS stir bars, which are an absorbent polymer on a stir bar. You basically stir it into the beer for a certain amount of time, and then you kind of carefully dry it, and you put it on the GCMS, and then the GCMS heats the stir bar up, the volatile compounds desorb, and then run through your GCMS. And that allows you to get a chemical profile of what's there. What's really interesting that we know from like previous studies is there are some compounds we know are really important for aroma, like I said earlier, fatty acid esters. The reason why we really like using GCMS for this is it lets us look at a lot of different compounds. So we look at a lot of compounds, and we know that, if we were to look at just like the 10, 20, maybe even 30 most abundant compounds, we would not have the important information. The compounds that are most important, so things like fatty acid esters, tend to be like a shoulder off of what is a more major peak. Their concentration is low, and that's because a lot of the compounds that are most important for flavor, really making the difference between one sample and the next, are the chemicals that are right at the flavor threshold, where you're just barely able to detect them, and where a one-fold difference might make the difference between it's below the flavor threshold to it's above it to it's very high above the flavor threshold. But those might be really, really minute changes in concentration, like ppm different levels of concentration. So you can't just look at what's most abundant. You really have to look at everything holistically, and that is just like it's a whole can of worms. It's a whole circus. So we look at individual compounds that we know to be really important. For example, like fatty acid esters. I've probably picked on that one enough at this point. I could pick something else, but we also look at things like sesquiterpenes. One of the other caveats of chemical analysis is your chemical analysis really is only as good as you're able to identify those compounds, and that can be really difficult. We have a lot of structurally very complex molecules, like the whole family of sesquiterpenes are really closely related, but can be really different chemically. And you can also have situations where you have two chemicals that are going to give the same fragmentation pattern, but they might be stereoisomers of each other, and they will be perceived by a human as very different because we are able to distinguish stereoisomers with our nose, and my GC cannot do that. So what we do is we lump a lot of things together to make our analysis make a little bit more sense that way, so that we're not looking at 200 individual compounds. We might pick out, I think for the study we did like around 40 individual compounds plus compound classes. So we would look at all of the sesquiterpenes holistically, and that's really powerful because then it doesn't matter if I have this cadmine and ylang misidentified with each other or something like that. They're all just grouped together as total sesquiterpenes. And we can see, for example, sesquiterpenes decrease over time and sesquiterpene oxides globally increasing over time. As that product ages, we see some oxidation. And then we can track that by GC and correlate that with a decrease in overall intensity of like the hop aroma. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. Chemically, we're looking at those decrease of certain things over time, increase of certain other things over time, and trying to relate that to the sensory results we're getting to try to help draw some conclusions. And then, ideally develop some specifications where we say, okay, it has to have at least this amount of sesquiterpenes and this maximum amount of sesquiterpene oxides in order for it to meet our quality expectations.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that makes a lot of sense. So you're looking at it, you're saying, you're picking like, okay, let's say the sesquiterpenes, let's use those, or sesquiterpene oxides as an example. You're saying, I can measure this sample and we're going to do this study over time. So we're going to age hop kick over time, brew a fresh beer each time, dose in hop kick, measure these compounds, correlate that with Jeff's sensory data, and then be able to say, okay, here's a analysis that we can do from a chemical perspective that says this is the point where the sesquiterpenes or sesquiterpene oxides or whatever, if we watch this compound, this is the point where we no longer want to sell this product, or we no longer, or maybe a better way to say it is, this product is no longer what we want it to be. Whenever it's out in the public or whatever. Is that a fair way to say that, Julia? Did I get that right?
Yeah, so it's sort of like that. I would say that what's determining when it stops being good is the sensory data, and then we can look back at our study and say, okay, at this level of this chemical, this was no longer meeting our expectations. And that's where we can kind of like draw the cutoff. But we have to, at least for the initial study, have that sensory data to correlate it to. Because otherwise, we don't know at what threshold it's good or bad without having the sensory data alongside.
Well, sure. And I would say, too, probably even for the future studies, you'd still want some sensory data, right? Just to make sure that you're like actually correlating. And I have a question, too. Would this also, like, is there a different dimension of this, too, when you're looking at different hop varieties? So, like, for example, sesquiterpenes may be important for, say, Citra, but not for Centennial.
Yeah, so we actually have a replicate of this. All the data presented at the ASBC, that was for one variety. Those presentations are really short. They're like 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes if you're allowing time for questions. So we did not include more than one variety in that study, but for all the varieties that are going to be in the initial launch, we have done the same study. So we have done all of the crazy amount of work that you'll see in the presentation times like what, 5? So
times 6, yeah.
Okay.
Oh wow,
it's a lot of fun.
I blocked it out.
Yep.
Times 6. That's amazing. But that's creating a really incredible data set, right? I mean, and I'm just focusing just on the chemistry right now, too. I'm going to let Jeff, I'm going to talk about the sensory here in just a minute. But focusing just on the chemistry right now, this is an amazing set of data. You've got all of these different compounds that you're looking at over different time points and over different hop varieties. How do you assess all of that, right? How do you go like, okay, yeah, this is what's important or this is not? I mean, that's just a huge volume of information to sort through.
Yeah, it is a very like significant challenge. This really built on the work that Marshall did, which is why I included him as an author on our talk, even though he's moved on and works at a different company now.
Right, that's Marshall Laguerre, right? Marshall Laguerre?
Right. Yeah. So he's a former analytical chemist from Haas. He works at another in another industry actually now. He's left hops for now. I don't think he would mind coming back, but anyways, he's left hops for now. And basically, he built this tool where we kind of look at a spectra. We have an internal library as well as just a general like published NIST library to do compound identification, and then we have some kind of like compound classing that we do to the data that puts it into a format that's much more useful for us. And then we have just kind of like taken that and taken it to like the next level. So we go through this compound classing where we, like I said, we have identified a certain number of compounds we know are important because they're consistent for that variety. Like there are certain compounds we know are really important for Citra, or that we know are really important for flavor, such as those fatty acid esters. Or just compound classing. So again, just the sum total of all of the sesquiterpenes, the sum total of all of the monoterpenes, the sum total of all the monoterpene oxides. And then we kind of limit it to a smaller number of data points, just to make it a little bit more digestible, because it is an overwhelming amount of data. And I think that is one of the big challenges of trying to incorporate chemical analysis for aroma, is that you are immediately in the realm of big data. Unless you are simplifying it down to just like the 10, 20, maybe 30 most abundant compounds, which I think it's oversimplifying it to the point of not being useful in my mind, because we know that those most abundant compounds maybe have really high flavor thresholds. And so they don't really have that much of a flavor impact versus things that are really minor might have a really huge flavor impact. So just looking at most abundant compounds is not going to tell you what you want to know. You really have to look at a very large number of compounds.
Right. And you're also into that threshold of saying sesquiterpene oxide. And a lot of brewers are just going to look at you and go, I don't know what that means, and that's it. Right. And then they're not going to try to do anything else with that information. And that's totally okay. I totally understand that. Not everybody's interested in that sort of stuff. But that's really where sensory becomes important and crucial, right, Jeff? Is because, or is that correct?
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. It's like Julie was saying, you have limited resources in your lab, so you might be able to, with your own setup, track the 10 most abundant compounds. But we know, both heuristically and just in general, that the least abundant compounds have outsized impact. So when we're talking about polyfunctional thiols, when we're talking about 4-MMP and 3-MH and 3-MHA, those buzzwords that are out there, those are in the parts per trillion, the high parts per trillion to low parts per billion. They will never show up as one of the top 10 most abundant compounds. And so we have to take into account the total flavor outcome of a product, of a raw material and ingredient, and the end beer, to understand the quality and the end shelf life of a product, regardless of the chemistry. But thankfully, the chemistry is actually assisting the sensory the way that we're doing it now with this, the compound classing and the tracking of individual compounds, because it can help take sensory data that has nuances to it, where there's not necessarily a huge statistical significance in the trends that we're seeing, but it helps explain that trend. And if we have both the chemical analysis and the sensory analysis saying the same trend, we know it's important, even though it's not necessarily at a statistical level significant. It's meaningful because we have those measures.
I see. So something that maybe isn't, statistically different or statistically not true to type, but you were seeing something in the chemistry. You're seeing maybe what looks like a shift, but then the chemistry data itself is also showing what sort of looks like a shift, even though it's not statistically significant in the sensory data. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And if it's an individual compound or a class, if it's an individual compound that we know isn't going to recover, that it's just going to accelerate in terms of its degradation, then that gives us an idea of, well, how flexible is this endpoint as a shelf life when we know these things are developing rapidly and have a correlation with negative sensory outcomes.
So talk to us then about the shelf life study and about hop kick, right? So I think let's start with the sensory, because I think that makes a lot of sense for like the jump off point. You mentioned earlier that you guys do QDA, quantitative descriptive analysis, and then a couple of other panels. Talk to us about what you did and then kind of what you guys found from a sensory perspective.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the top of the show that our focus, the major training that our panel goes through, is quantitative descriptive analysis. And that's just a form of a trained sensory panel where we have a set lexicon. We call it the HopSess lexicon. We've been using it for 6 years now. And we train our panel using standards that relate to the overall aromatic quality of those categories, which you can get in the aroma standards kit that they sell at YVH. And then we go through individual sub-attributes, training on getting people to be able to identify not just tropical fruits, but guava, to create an overall picture of what sweet fruits, which includes stone fruits and tropical fruits, what those are together as an aroma class, to create a new picture, a new memory set. And then from there, we train them on how to scale the relative intensities using different standards, different beers, different hops, different standards, that some of which have standardized sensory profiles because it's a beer that's really consistent and has been very hoppy and consistent over time. So I can confidently say, based on 3 years of sensory data, this beer, when you're rating it, my panel, you should be getting a 6.5 out of 10 thereabouts for the sweet fruit, a 2 out of 10 for the vegetal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the main testing type that we do. That's the quantitative data that is so useful when it comes to creating correspondence between compound classes and sensory outcomes when it comes to these also flavor groups like floral or citrus. On top of that, we measure for what I call effective measures, where it's the hedonic liking, just how much do you like this on a 0 to 10 scale? 0, I hate it. 11 or 10, I love it. We have overall hop aromatic intensity, which we adopted from Tom's lab that you work in, and that's just a rated overall intensity of the beer, the hop, what have you. And on top of that, we've layered in a gut check measure called true to typeness, where we've had enough panels that have been on panel and part of intake and have done enough panels that they have a fairly robust picture of different varieties of hops. And so they have an idea of what is good when it's a Citra versus bad. So they have that experience. And then we have a written prompt regarding general descriptors of what Citra is and specific. And then based on that, please rate the relative true to typeness. From 0, it's not at all Citra, to 10, it's at outstanding Citra. And so those are the two different testing groupings that we have, and they produce the data that we used here in this study.
Nice. Okay. So that makes sense to me. Those are a bunch of different ways to look at sensory data, right? Look at individual attributes and their intensity, also checking to see what the overall smell is or how strong it is, if people like it, and then making sure that it is actually Citra. So if you're doing Citra hop kick, that it actually smells like Citra and not Sabro whenever it's coming out. So then in this shelf life study, what did you guys see as Hopkick aged?
We saw a lot of things, Cade. I know that's a cop out because, like Julie's saying, we had 34 individual compounds. We had 18 compound classes. We have our 12 aroma measures. We have our 3 effective measures. And so narrowing down the data and seeing how it worked together was really complicated. But in the end, we did see, to some degree, what we've expected from experience, but also based on what should be happening as a product ages. We saw over time that the efficacy of the product as something that can boost overall aroma declined. We didn't see as big of a delta compared to the control over time. We saw that liking went down over time. We saw that the perceived true to typeness went down over time. And that's why we have those 3 different effective measures. They act as a baseline for a survival analysis. We know that maybe the aroma is going down over time, but the liking is increasing. So that's useful. That's not what we saw here. Or maybe we saw that the liking is going up, but the true to type is going down, in which case we have a whole other problem. But that's, right. Thankfully, that's not what we saw.
Right. And you can also, merge this with those attribute data as well, too, right? So you can say, like, for example, I think one of the things you guys found was a green fruit character went down over time, right? Or really green fruit character was kind of in the first trial, but then it went down over, the next few months. Citrus character might have changed over time, for example, decreased or something over time. And so you can kind of point to what's happening to the product as it changes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So early on, we have flavor attributes that are correlated with true to typeness, especially with Citra. So depending on the panelist segment, it's either very high in citrus and sweet fruits, tropical fruits, or very high in citrus and vegetal. There's that individual sensitivity when it comes to the sulfurs that make tropical fruits tropical. And for some people, it goes very vegetal. So we do normally see a lot of high correlation between tropical scoring and vegetal scoring in that way. And then over time, as valuable sulfur compounds oxidized, as sesquiterpenes oxidized, as other compounds condensed into esters, we saw an increase in some sweet characteristics. Citrus actually increased after the first couple of months, and then with the further oxidation of sesquiterpenes and things like that, it came all the way around to just being much more potent in a floral and spicy direction, losing all of those positive fruity characteristics that we're looking for in a true to type product.
Interesting. And this is really useful information from sensory perspective, right? Because you're able also to say, okay, here's what the product is like at any one time. But then from a packaging standpoint, when Hopkick comes out, it's going to say, like, this is what it's going to taste like if you use it in beer. So this is also the data, not this data from this study, but data like this is what you're using to put together those attributes that you would have for consumers whenever they look at and are purchasing the product.
Yeah, it's the sensory data that we produce to provide some guidance. There's always your mileage may vary because everyone that picks up a bottle will be different. But that's also why we go to these extreme ends of, we do some ratings on the raw materials, but we do full brewing trials for each of these data points because, frankly, with most extracts, when you open it and your measure is, well, does it still smell right? Well, it probably does still smell right because it's so potent and concentrated in that extract form.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, right? But whenever you brew with it and dilute it out, is it still going to smell the same? And so then, Julia, the question then for you is okay, what about chemistry, right? Were you able to point to any specific chemicals or chemical compound classes, for example, that changed over time and maybe gave you some interesting information or insights of things to look at in the future?
Yeah, it's definitely a noisy data set. There's a lot of data, and they're in beer every time. But there were a few things that really stood out. So fatty acid alcohols decreased over time. MTH, so that's one of our thiol compounds, methylthiohexanoate, that decreased over time. And humulene epoxide increased over time. So that's an indicator for oxidation, aging of sesquiterpenes. So there was a few good trends over time, but, I think if you have a chance, you can go look at the presentation for yourself. But describing it for an audio-only audience here, if you look at those three trends with time, they're not the same trend. If you overlaid them, you would really make three different shelf life decisions based on those three compounds. And so in order to really do proper analysis on this, just looking at the chemistry data, just looking at the sensory data, is really difficult. And even looking at them together is really difficult. In order to really make conclusions from this, we had to go to multi-factor analysis.
Okay. And so talk through that.
So multiple factor analysis is kind of the way that we correlated both sensory and chemistry data. It's one of many different statistical methods you can use to basically compare big data sets. There's a lot of reasons why we really liked multiple factor analysis versus something like PLS, which is partially squared. Some really great things about multiple factor analysis. Let me evangelize for just a second from a statistics standpoint. Although as an organic chemist, I'm probably the last person who should be talking about statistics, but it does not assume linearity. You're not trying to necessarily build a model here. It's more descriptive than predictive. But the thing that I think is really powerful personally about multiple factor analysis is that it treats both data sets equally. So it treats the chemistry data and the sensory data, even though those tables are very different size. One is more categorical, maybe even, and one is more, numerical. It kind of can treat continuous and non-continuous variables the same, but it also can treat the data sets of different sizes the same. So, just because of how the sheer number of different chemical compounds that we want to look at, because we know it's important that we look at that number of compounds, what can happen if you don't have that equalizing force that multiple factor analysis does, where it scales both tables to the same weight? You can have, just because you have so much more chemical data, most of your correlation will be in the chemical data, basically. And so you'll have kind of an outsized influence where almost all of the variation in the factors that it comes up with at the end will be due to variation in the chemical data set, and kind of minimize the variation that was in the sensory data set. Multiple factor analysis weights those two tables the same so that they're both given equal influence on like the final trends, the final factors that it comes up with.
Okay. I think that makes sense. And so let's talk through then some of the results then, or at least maybe let's bring it back down, to sort of a brewer takeaway level. What would you be able to do with multifactorial analysis then in this instance? Like how would you be able to say, what changes or what chemistry components are correlated with changes in sensory?
Yeah, so it's basically just a really powerful way to make good biplots. And if you're able to read a biplot, which I definitely should not assume just like everybody on the street can read a biplot, but just, basically the closer things are in space, the more heavily related they are, and the more farther apart they are in space, the less related they are. And what this analysis technique gets you at the end is some really fancy biplots at the end of the day. And then it's up to you to kind of look at these and say, okay, these two things are close in space, so these things aren't. And hopefully, and at least in our analysis, a lot of those things really made sense. So things like citrus and our polyfunctional thiol MTH, pretty close in space. Like that totally makes sense. Things like spicy and sesquiterpenes and sesquiterpene oxides are, close in space. Overall liking was close with fatty acid esters, which is something that we knew previously from prior studies not related to this one, correlates normally very highly. And then, with this analysis, we have that kind of space of the sensory attributes, the chemical attributes, how close or far apart they are from each other, but then also where do our time points fall within that? So at what point does our time point, data point move from being close to high street food, high overall liking, high citrus, away from that and towards things like spicy, vegetal, floral? And that is what allowed us to kind of say, okay, here's the line where now this is too closely associated with with spicy and vegetal and not closely enough related to sweet fruit and citrus, that we're going to draw the line and say, after this point, we don't recommend using it anymore.
Interesting. So you're able to put all of this together using the chemistry data in addition to the sensory data, right? So it's not just, using the sensory data to say, okay, this is where overall liking went below a 5, for example, and using that as your cutoff point. This is putting together both overall liking, putting together all that data, and also combining it with the chemistry data. And then you're able to say, like, okay, maybe when we measure these compounds, if we measure high sesquiterpenes, then that's kind of a point where we can say, okay, this product has reached its shelf life.
Yeah. Yes. So that is basically what we're doing here. We only went out to 10 months on the study because we were expecting the shelf life to be, between like 3 and 9 months. Based on this, we probably should have gone longer. I think we would have seen an even bigger difference between, even more advancement towards that spicy vegetal. But I think, once the product was in final packaging, it just held up a lot better than we initially expected it to, which is good for our product, but bad for our study.
That's okay.
If we could rewind, we would, have more data points.
Right. Hold it for longer, right?
3 years of data points pointing towards a maximum of 10 months.
That's funny. Yeah, and it just did better, right? Yeah. It did better than you guys expected. Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic, right? That's great great for the product itself. Not great for the study in this case, but hey, that's okay. You just get to do it all again, right, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I am not agreeing to redo this right now.
Just kidding. Okay, so at the end of the day, what you were able to do with this information is say, like, okay, yeah, Hopkick. Are y'all able to say what the shelf life is of Hopkick, or it's just at least 10 months? Sounds like.
So that kind of brings us to an existential question of what is quality, like at what point is the shelf life?
Yeah.
It's really easy for things where it's going to go bad in a microbial way that will make you sick, or for things where there's like very clearly, like if the alpha acids are degrading and there's a point where it's no longer going to make your beer bitter and it's a bittering product. But for aroma products, it's so much more complicated. So where you draw the line for the shelf life of an aroma product, this is something we have literally hour-long meetings, like at once a month, where we just tackle with this, what I consider a very existential question of what is quality, what is the shelf life, what is aroma even. So yeah, I think at this point, it's kind of subjective, where we think we have to kind of get in the minds of our customers. What is our customers' expectations of this product? And are we, at what point are we probably not going to meet that expectation?
So then I was going to ask this question of you, and I think this is a good spot for it to do this then. So you had suggested that one of the things that would be great, that would be awesome if we could do, so if we had this chemical data, if we could then say, for a given concentration of XYZ compound or XYZ, set of compounds, this is what the sensory impact might be. Or, for example, we might be able to predict and say, here is how Hopkick aroma is going to change over time based on chemical concentrations. That'd be really cool to be able to do. But are you able to do it with this data set?
I don't think we are quite there yet, but it's something that we're working closer to. Yeah. It's something that, when I started at Haas in 2020, we were farther away from being able to do that than we are today.
Yeah.
But it's still something that we're working towards. And it's really just kind of like the holy grail, right?
Yeah.
Not that I want to put Jeff out of a job, but maintaining a sensory panel is difficult. Maintaining an engaged sensory panel is difficult, and they're subjective. So, in cases where maybe there's like some case where you'd want a more objective measurement, let's say like somebody says this product is not meeting my expectations and I want like a refund or something like that. And then, they're able to say, like, look, chemically, this is different than, or maybe on our end, we say chemically, this is the same as it was when we sold it to you, something like that, where you can, where you really want a more, quantitative measure versus a qualitative measure. And sensory does get pretty quantitative, but there are just times where you might want chemical analysis. Or, for example, sensory panel is a really laborious thing. That means you can only collect a data point every maybe couple of months. We have a lot of projects in the pipeline. If we develop a really good model, maybe we can collect more data points. Maybe we still have sensory data points, but maybe we have sensory data points every couple of months, but we have chemical data points every week.
Mm-hmm.
That's like an exaggeration. I don't have time for that either. But just as an example of where you could go, where eventually, if you have a really good model, collecting the chemical data can be much higher throughput.
Well, yeah, and it is also, like I say all the time too, with brulosophy results and with sensory data, right? That's kind of like Jeff mentioned. That's the end user, right? That's the end product. Like, what does the user of this product think about it? What does it taste like, and how can you describe it, and all of that stuff? But you still also need to be able to troubleshoot, right? If something is wrong, or if it changed over time, if there's a difference, for example, between true to type, you got to be able to point to something about went wrong. And that's where chemistry data can also come in and play a big role too, right, Jeff? Is that fair?
No, that's precisely right. And it goes into why we chose multi-factor analysis as the method for analysis, because we've got our qualitative measurements in the form of the OHI, the liking, the true to typeness. We've got our quantitative data in terms of the sensory intensities for each of the categories. We've got our chemistry data on top of that. And it's when the sensory says shelf life's at 10 months according to one set of measures, but 7 at another, and the chemistry is up in the air because there's so many compounds. MFA puts together a correspondence model that treats all those things equally, and then we can say, okay, based on all of our measures together in this noisy world of data, being averaged out, it points towards this shelf life. And based on doing this over and over again, we can learn the relationships in aging along the terms of these different compounds that are common versus unique in our different products and our different varieties. And from there, using what Julia's talking about in terms of a large number of data sets rapidly over time, we can have that large data set and analysis moving forward. And at a certain point, based on the chemistry, we can make my life easier and just do a check-in on the sensory to make sure that from a consumer's perspective, it's still going to perform acceptably.
Yeah. I mean, getting all this information, having access to all of that data would be really useful, especially from a hop supplier, because you can start to look at varietal differences. You can start to look at year-over-year differences and consistency of lot to lot and all these other factors that are super important for consistency, but also provide information for the brewer, because that's what you guys have said multiple times. And it sounds like that's sort of an ethos of Haas is what does it make good beer, right? And all of this, the chemistry and the sensory, are both pointing in that direction. So Julia, I always ask this question at the end of the show, is this: if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be? And I'm going to let you think about it for a second, because Jeff should have prepared. He knew this was coming. So Jeff's going to go first.
I could cop out and use the same one as the last 3 episodes. Brewers should take away that they should buy more Sabro Incognito. It's as true now as it was 2 years ago when I first said it.
Keep Jeff and Julia employed.
But the one takeaway I think most important for brewers, because this is so nerdy. This entire thing is so nerdy, and it's out there, and it seems like there's no way that this could be applied to any average brewer. The main takeaway is data is scary, but you need to learn it, and there will always be a way to collect data that is useful in your circumstance. You got to pay attention, take data down, don't run from the gut all the time, make decisions based on quantitative objective data. And you can do that through a number of methods, including what we talked about today.
Yeah, I mean, the great Adam Savage said the only difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. So write it down and take the data. All right, Julia, you've hopefully had sufficient time. If you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of us wanting to present this data at an ASBC meeting is we get this question not infrequently of, I'm thinking about incorporating GCMS into my brewery, especially for the larger brewers. And they want to know how do they do that? And once they get the data, what do they do with the data? Because otherwise you basically buy a Ferrari and then just like leave it parked in your garage. So, because they're not cheap, and maintaining, a chemist who's knowledgeable enough to operate a GCMS and get meaningful data is also a pretty hardy endeavor. So why would you want to do that, and how do you do it? I think the things you have to do is have a really good sensory panel, a well-trained, robust, engaged sensory panel, and then, have a good instrument and somebody who knows how to use it. And then, collect a lot of data, like Jeff was saying, and you can do things like multi-factor analysis to make that data really digestible. I think, if we had just done the sensory data, we probably would have came to the same conclusion as we did with the sensory and the chemistry data. Additionally, if we had just done kind of more basic statistical analysis without going through the trouble of doing multi-factor analysis, I think we would have worked a lot harder and we would have still came to the same conclusion. But by doing both the chemistry and the sensory data, and by also doing statistics on it, we feel much more comfortable in where we drew our shelf life.
Yeah.
And ultimately, shelf life is subjective because you're asking yourself, does this meet my customer's expectations with an aroma product? So having the ability to sleep at night, knowing that I've set what I think is a true, a correct shelf life for the product, that's really what you get out of it. And you can also get that out of your analyzing your beers, for example, if you were a brewer who was looking to implement more chemical analysis in tandem with sensory into things like shelf life or quality assessments of your beer.
Right. Yeah. And that's it. Right. I mean, it is. It's using all of this information, right? Using it all together, using just the chemistry, the sensory, combining it all together and making it useful, because you want consistency and you want to be confident that what you're doing is accurate, right? Even a brewer that's brewing a batch of beer that they're selling to a consumer wants to be confident that that beer is true to type and that it has what it's supposed to have in it, the flavors and aromas and all that stuff that the consumer wants. It's the same for ingredient suppliers. It's the same for home brewers. It's the same top to bottom in the whole chain. Everybody wants to make sure that they're making great beer and be confident that the beer that they're brewing is good. And that's where sensory and chemistry data comes together. Well, cool. Thank you both for coming on and talking about this. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to share that we didn't get to today? All right, crickets. That's good. That means we got through everything, or at least hopefully we did. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining me for the first time in the Brew Lab, and I can't wait to have you back to talk about some more of the fun stuff you're doing at Haas.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. And Jeff, as always, thank you too.
Anytime. I'm sure I'll be back to talk about consumer research or something. We've got a list.
Yeah, consumer research, Hopkick. We've got a whole bunch of things. So he'll be back. And Julia, again, I expect to hear back from you as well, too. So we look forward to that. All right. So listeners, in the abstract, you will actually find a link to the presentation that Julia gave at the 2023 annual meeting of the ASBC, which was titled Joint Use of GCMS and Trained Panel Data for Monitoring and Determining the Shelf Life of a Novel Hop Oil-Based Ingredient in a Model Beer System. All right, next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science to this episode, so we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.